Joshua, should we talk about what happened at the Rose Bowl? It was, I guess, a rout at the Rose Bowl.
Is a route. Real quick, you mentioned Cinderella, and I just want to go on record as saying, I think I've come to the conclusion after a very small sample size, because this is what we do in media, that Cinderella in this playoff format is the blue blood team that has a really talented roster that screws around a little bit, right? They lose to another good team during the year. Maybe they lose to a rival in a game that they probably should win. And then they get into the postseason and everything clicks.
So I'm sorry, are you saying Ohio State is a Cinderella?
I'm saying that's what this playoff does. That would be what we would consider a Cinderella for this playoff, because I'm not convinced that we're really ever going to get the group of 5 team who just makes a run, or like, the last conference champion that gets in and makes a run. I do think it's structured for these teams that had high expectations and maybe stubbed their toe a couple of times to just get really hot in the postseason and handle things extremely well. And all of a sudden, in most years of college football where they wouldn't have been able to compete for a championship, they might be the best team and they end up winning it. I think that's what that looks like, neither here nor there. But let's talk about this Rose Bowl rout. Ohio State defeats Oregon 41-21. I remember an Ohio State game where the Buckeyes beat Oregon 42-20. Very interesting on the parallels there. These dudes have been on fire offensively. They score on 6 of their first 7 drives. I'm watching the end of Texas and Arizona State, and then the game flips over to the Rose Bowl, and Ohio State had already scored. You're giving me the update because you're there. They had already scored. Oregon's getting ready to punt, and then Ohio State's going to score again. It's like, what are we doing? Like, it's absolutely nuts. 500 yards of total offense. Jeremiah Smith was ridiculous. 7 catches, almost 190 yards, a couple of touchdowns. Travion Henderson was really good too. He had the long 66-yard run. And it was an Ohio State defense that looked very different from the first time they played Oregon. That first game they played against them, they had 0 sacks. They had 8 sacks in this game, 13 TFLs total. Very physical. They were coming downhill, smacking people. And we talked about Oregon with the long layoff there, but certainly Ohio State has figured things out, and they are looking like the team people in the preseason said they could be.
Right. I think this was the team that we were all waiting to see. Like, we thought that this was in there somewhere. And that's, I think, what was so frustrating with like all of those slow starts over the course of the regular season. And then the Michigan game where they weren't trying to throw the ball at all. It was this team was there waiting to be unlocked, waiting to be unleashed. And I still think it's like some of the best football that we've seen in years. Like if you look at like individual quarters, like the first quarter against Tennessee, maybe even I would say like a quarter and a half at the Rose Bowl, like it was 34-0. No, in no scenario, in no way of evaluating and talking and predicting that game, certainly we would not have been surprised if Ohio State won. I think if we had filled out our brackets after seeing what they were capable of against Tennessee, I probably would have picked them to win it all. But there was nowhere on my bingo card, nowhere in any possibility in my brain was 34-0 at any point in this game. And it was basically 34-0. Oregon is basically shell-shocked before they even can respond. And they did respond, right? They fought back right before the end of the first half, fought back a little bit in the second half. I think there is a credit to Oregon absolutely for that. But when Ohio State is playing like that and they are steamrolling their opponents, I don't know that there's anyone that can hang with them. Like, we're going to have like a week here I'm going to talk myself into Texas and how they're going to make it a game. Right. And there's a ton of talent there, as you just said. No doubt. But if Ohio State keeps doing this, having watched it in person, I just don't know what you do. Like, I don't know how you stop Jeremiah Smith and Emeka Egbuka enough. And you still have Travion Henderson, you still have the run game. Will Howard is so comfortable right now in what he's doing. They're calling great plays. Like Chip Kelly was so aggressive in this game right out of the jump. And then a defense that, to your point, was all over the place. I don't even think they were like blitzing on some of those sacks and some of those TFLs. Like, they were just everywhere. And it's all coming together. Like, Dan Lanning was like, we could not move the ball. And also like they couldn't like we couldn't stop them. It was both things. Right. And that's as simple as you could put it, but that's exactly what was happening in that game. And it's impossible. It's just like, it's like a freight train running at you. And it's so hard. Like, I don't know what you can take away if Ohio State is doing all of those things on both sides of the ball so well. This is an Oregon team program, by the way, that the last 2 years, they gave up 5 total sacks the entire season last season and the season before. 8 in this one game.
Yeah. It's kind of ridiculous. And like, I keep going back to this idea that the Ohio State offensive line is still kind of the thing, right? Like, if you're going to try to beat them, you have to create pressure. But I've talked about Derek Harmon. I think he was the second best defensive tackle in the Big Ten all year long, and that's behind Mason Graham, who's going to be a top 5 pick in the draft. They had Twin Towers out there, and Jordan Birch and Mateo Uyunglele. Those guys combined for like 2 or 3 tackles in the game. Like, that's how you know it's just like they're on a different level right now, where they're going up against one of the best defensive lines in the country, and their weakness is the offensive line, and those guys don't really have an impact on the football game. I'm very curious to see how it continues to go. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to talk myself into Texas, making it a really tough game for Ohio State. But if Ohio State does what they've been doing, I just don't know how it works out. But there is a flip side of this, and I want to ask you this question. I think Oregon's still a really, really good football team, and they tried to fight their way back. It was just too little, too late. But they didn't quit in that game. You know, they tried to get some momentum. You told me that at one point the stadium got really loud on the Oregon side. And when you're fighting back from 34-0, it's hard to get everybody back invigorated in a game like that. But that's how good of a program Oregon is. How do you reconcile the regular season 13-0 Big Ten champs? They beat Ohio State. They beat Penn State. They went on the road and beat Michigan, who was not very good. But those were the 3 teams in the Big Ten. And then they get into the postseason and lay an egg.
Yeah, I think it's really tough because it was hard to go undefeated this year. They were the only ones who did it. Everybody else tripped up. They won their clunkers.
You know how I feel about how.
Yeah, you think it's actually relatively easy to win in the regular season.
I do.
But again, harder than for others.
No, it was especially this year. It was very difficult. I'm not trying to take anything away. It's just
but they did. They won their clunkers. They won their big games.
Mm-hmm.
They obviously had flaws. Like we saw them, but we saw them get better over the course of the season. We saw them prepare. Saw the offensive line and the changes that they made early in the season like really pay off for them. And Dylan Gabriel is just a really good, experienced veteran quarterback. But it's hard because I think that this is what always happens with the postseason. It's the last look at a team for a long off season, and it sets narratives and it gets people upset, especially the way you lose. It felt like people were immediately turning back to Dan Lanning can't win big games.
Right.
Even though we saw them, win that thriller in Autzen, even though we saw them, go and take care of business against Penn State, a team that is also in the Final Four of this bracket in the Big Ten championship game. I think that it is tough. It is tough to be like, hey, how does Oregon take that next step? Like, people thought that they did this year. People thought that coming to the Big Ten, the way that they were built, the way that they had played, that they had accomplished that they were prepared for this. And they felt that way. That's what they said at Big Ten Media Day and at the Rose Bowl Media Day. Like all the course of the season, like they felt like they had built and prepared and developed for this situation. And again, I think a lot of it does have to do with you're cold. You're about to start your first game of a postseason against a team that was like already at 99% of their best. But it's a really tough thing to end the season this way. And with the amount of investment that went into that roster, Phil Knight factor and all of that, like it's hard when you have all of that and then you don't succeed and you don't even win a game in the college football playoff. I don't know. I don't know, necessarily like how you flip that or turn the page. I mean, I still think Dan Lanning is the guy. I like the way he's building. I like the way he coaches. I like the way he runs his program. But it's going to be a long off season, I think, in Oregon with just the amount of talent, the amount of investment, and all they had accomplished, the expectations that they were going to be able to take that big next step that didn't happen.
I'll say this is, and take this from somebody who lives it. When the only thing that you're concerned with is winning a national title, you're going to be miserable there are going to be 133 miserable teams because there's only one that gets to do it. And they did something that nobody else in the Big Ten, nobody else in college football got to do. They went undefeated in the regular season, right? Like, that's a huge deal. And then they won their conference title. So they get to hang a banner for that. I don't know how they do it over there. A lot of teams give out rings for that. Like, there are things that they can hang their hat on. They came in immediately in the Big Ten and challenged to be the face of the conference. They had the coach who was challenging to be the coach of not only of the conference really, but of college football. Like, had they made some noise here, that is the profile that they elevated themselves to in year one in the Big Ten. And so I think being disappointed is perfectly warranted. Like, that was a tough performance to have to live with in the offseason. I also think that, like, you can get yourself into very miserable places as a fan base when you have a very narrow scope of how you would define success for a season. If that means a national title for a program, by the way, and this is not to take shots, but like, you don't have that. That's not your heritage. You can get yourself real miserable real quick and saying crazy things about a coach who's doing a great job. So for Oregon, this is the building phase. You have to have these experiences to get ultimately where you're going. But it's hard for me to look back and say that they didn't have a great season because it was phenomenal there.